A few times, right? You said I'm gonna a few times? Okay.
I am already tired of it.
Hello, and welcome to my virtual CWSO conference presentation. My name is Connor Syrewicz. I am a PhD student at SUNY Albany, and let me start by extending my gratitude to the conference organizers. Thank you so much for all the hard work you've put into this conference. On behalf of the creative writing community, I am so very grateful to be here talking about my research, and that would not be possible were it not for the hard work and dedication of the conference organizers, a level of dedication which is even more impressive given that it comes in the midst of such scary, dangerous, perilous times. So again, thank you. Today, I am going to be presenting a paper called Toward a Volupology of Literary Fiction. And if you don't know what volupology means, that's okay because I made it up. The word combines the Latin prefix volup, which means pleasure, with the suffix ology, or the study of. So volupology is the study of pleasure. This paper is a part of a larger body of research, which I began not long after finishing my MFA in fiction. I had spent the last 3 years of my MFA asking myself the question, what kind of fiction do I want to write? And eventually I started to ask the opposite question, what do readers like to read and why? This is a question which is, I think, somewhat taboo to ask in the higher education creative writing community. Joseph Moxley, for example, in a 1985 paper on audience awareness, points out that, quote, professional fiction writers frequently report that first and foremost they consider their own ideas and desires when selecting writing topics and when composing. Moxley is, in this passage, contrasting the creative writing conception of audience awareness to those which have been common among rhetoricians and composition scholars, and his point is that the prevailing wisdom in some creative writing communities is that a creative writer shouldn't consider her audience. There is, I believe, actually real wisdom to this point of view. Worrying about being accepted by an audience can, for some writers, really impede their writing practice, and on top of that, worrying too much about audience acceptance can lead a writer to write work which may be, depending on the audience, politically or ethically unjust. Be good. On the other hand, I want my work on pleasure to challenge this prevailing wisdom, as I believe that worrying about my reader's pleasure can also be a deeply altruistic and caring thing to do. We as a community are often concerned with how our writing impacts society, and I believe that one of the most straightforward ways that we have to improve the lives of our readers is by writing things that they like. In terms of my own work, I don't write to be accepted or to be loved. I write because I love writing, because I love the act itself, because I love trying to solve the puzzle of writing interesting prose, because I love trying against all odds to say something rich and striking and beautiful. But part of what I love about writing is the struggle to try and craft work which is capable of bringing some enjoyment, some engagement, some interest, some significance, in a word, some pleasure into the lives of a reader. That said, the question of pleasure, as I have found out, is deeply complex. Any single instance of pleasure is a complex interaction of text, language, genre, psychology, culture, identity, and reading context. So clearly, there is much work to be done if we want to account for all these factors. In what follows, I will use some of the findings from cognitive psychology, specifically from the field of the psychology of emotions, experimental aesthetics, and positive psychology, in order to offer some deeply provisional, hypothetical thoughts about why some readers of literary fiction like literary fiction. However, my work here barely scratches the surface of everything there is to know about the pleasures of reading. And given that the cognitive perspective, which I'm employing here, is deeply limited, other approaches to the question of pleasure are not only viable, but desirable. One can easily imagine a number of different accounts of pleasure: socio-cultural accounts, institutional accounts, feminist accounts, critical race accounts, and so on, providing vital and valuable insights into the diverse and multifaceted pleasures of reading as they exist today. Therefore, before I present my hypotheses, let me extend an invitation. I think that we should, as a scholarly community, take the question of pleasure very seriously. And so I would encourage you, if you are so inclined, to take up volupological studies of your own. My email is on the screen, and if you are interested in corresponding or collaborating, I would encourage you to write me. I believe that there's much to be gained for us as a community of writers and scholars by setting our sights on pleasure. But this, of course, raises a really important question. What is there to be gained from a pedagogical perspective from understanding what readers like and why they like it? In the paper, I address the pedagogical implication of volupology, and while I don't have time to address these implications now, I can assure you that knowledge regarding the pleasures of reading would be capable of informing our pedagogy considerably, and probably not in the ways that you'd think. So, if you're interested in my thoughts on this, I'd encourage you to ask me during the question and answer session, which will take place on Saturday, October 10th from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern Time. In any case, I believe that the pedagogical applications of this knowledge are, to my mind, numerous, but for now, I'd like to turn to my hypotheses. So, as I said before, I set out to understand why some readers of literary fiction like literary fiction, which means that I first have to ask an important question: what is literary fiction? In this paper, I handle the intricacies of this question at some length, but here I only have time to gloss my findings. So, based on original archival research, I make the claim that literary fiction is actually an incredibly new genre of fiction, and that it only came to be used as a genre designation in the 1990s, really. This term, literary fiction, of course, existed long before the 1990s, originating in academia before migrating into the publishing houses. But the concept did not begin to be used as a genre designation on par with science fiction or romance fiction until the 1990s. After delivering this historical narrative in my paper, I then turned to a discursive analysis of the genre, in which I attempt to account for the most prevalent textual conventions at work in the genre today. These textual conventions are quite numerous, as you can imagine, so I break them down into 7 sets of conventions, related conventions, which form the basis of my claims about pleasure. Unfortunately, I don't have the time now to elaborate on these categories, but it should suffice to say that even though no single work of literary fiction can be reduced to the conventions of the genre, I will be restricting my claims about pleasure to these conventions. In other words, my 3 hypotheses about pleasure will be attempting to answer the question: why do some readers of literary fiction like the conventions of literary fiction? My first hypothesis is that some readers of literary fiction really like complexity, which I'm defining here as a, quote, perceived diversity in a stimulus pattern. I base this claim on research in the psychology of emotions, which shows that people tend to find a stimuli interesting if they are likely to appraise it as novel, complex, uncertain, or conflicting. Therefore, it's not objective complexity that readers like, it is perceived or appraised complexity. In particular, my discourse analysis seems to suggest that literary fiction readers tend to like works of fiction which they would appraise as containing characters with diverse and varied personalities, language which is diverse and varied, and/or content which elicits from the reader diverse and varied emotions. In my paper, I go into some detail about some of the textual conventions which read as complex to readers, but I focus specifically on the injunction to show, don't tell. For example, I look at the following sentence from Alice Munro's Lives of Girls and Women, quote, "My mother spoke to the people who lived on Flax Road in a voice not so friendly as she used in town, with severe courtesy and a somehow noticeable use of good grammar." Interpretations are bound to vary, but I imagine that most readers of literary fiction would take the behaviors stated in this sentence to imply or to show something about the mother's personality, that she considers herself to be superior to the denizens of Flats Roads, and that she intends with her behavior to prove it to them, something along those lines. This statement could therefore be considered complex because it tells something about the mother's behavior while also showing something about the mother's personality. If we compare this to a version of the sentence which tells and doesn't show, for example, something like, my mother considered herself better than the people on Flats Roads and her actions sure showed it, and one will be able to see how the injunction to show don't tell is often based in a preference for statements which contain lots of cognitively diverse and varied information. Perceived complexity is, of course, only one part of the story. And in my second hypothesis, I draw upon experimental aesthetics in order to show that some literary fiction readers like fiction which is familiar and which affirms shared values. One of the better supported hypotheses from experimental aesthetics, known as cognitive fluency theory, shows that people tend to like art which is easily processed or understood. And I see some evidence in my discourse analysis that this is the case for literary fiction readers as well. For example, sociological evidence suggests that people who read for pleasure tend to be highly educated. And so it's probably no mistake that we see a lot of literary fiction about people who are like them, which is to say people who read, people who are educated, and so on. Likewise, education tends to correlate with valuing things like justice, equity, inclusivity, diversity, care, and so on. And so it's probably no surprise that we see a lot of literary fiction which demonstrates these values. These findings may be a bit distressing for some who like to think of literary fiction as being about challenging or confronting the reader. However, I argue that these are values which are largely worth supporting. As I write in the paper, literary fiction may sometimes be preaching to the choir, but doing so is far from pointless if it helps the choir to sing that much more loudly and clearly. Of course, literary fiction readers do like being challenged. So, as Kevin Brophy asks, what then of writing that confronts and unsettles? My third and final hypothesis attempts to explain this by arguing that some literary fiction readers like fiction which gives them feelings of meaning or significance. In making this claim, I draw upon positive psychology, and in particular the work of Martin Seligman, who in 2011 argued that happiness can be broken down into 5 categories: positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and achievement. And unsurprisingly, he calls this the PERMA model. Some literary fiction readers do, I argue, seem to like works of fiction which cause them some discomfort. However, I argue that they will only like this discomfort if they read the discomfort they're feeling as contributing to some meaningful purpose. For example, readers who enjoy reading difficult, innovative, and/or highly experimental works of fiction often report that they like this kind of fiction because interpreting a difficult text offers the possibility of, in the words of Ben Marcus, being exposed to unprecedented worlds of feeling which exist outside pre-approved modes of thought. And some readers will like reading about intensely painful or bleak subject matters so long as they feel that they are learning about the world as it actually is, or that they are empathizing with a lifelike character's pain, or that they are perceiving unflinchingly the truth of the world, or engaging in some other activity that they would think of as meaningful or important. In any case, to begin to conclude my presentation, these 3 hypotheses are just that, hypotheses. I am attempting to make some claims about how actual people come to form what we might call liking reactions to text. And so I would take everything that I have said with a boulder of salt. I am here doing nothing more than combining textual data with evidence from cognitive psychology in order to make some predictions about why it is that some readers like some conventions, and they, like all hypotheses or predictions, are simply starting points for investigation. These are not strong claims that I'm making. What is needed, as I said earlier, is more research. And so I'd like to repeat my invitation from earlier to join me in developing a Volupology of reading. My email's on the screen now, and I suggest that you write me if you're interested in corresponding or collaborating. This research, as hopefully I've shown, has the ability to improve our teaching, but perhaps more importantly, I believe that understanding why readers like texts has the ability to vastly improve the writing we produce. To be clear, not all pleasures are worth supporting. Some pleasures can be cruel or unjust or unfair and uncaring, but I do think that we underestimate the power of pleasure. In my paper, I cite research which suggests that subjective reports of one's overall happiness has been shown to correlate with a number of desirable outcomes related to health, relationships, and economic success. And so we stand to improve the lives of our readers considerably simply by making those lives happier. Far from being a distraction from the world's problems, therefore, pleasure may be an important solution to them. And for this reason, I think that we should seek to promote pleasure. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference.